Hello, welcome to this Jmeter introduction course. My name is Gabriel Starczewski and today I would like to walk you through basic functionalities of Jmeter with the ultimate goal that within probably an hour time or so you should be able to be quite fluent in managing and executing your Jmeter performance tests. So I'm planning to cover all important topics here. The only thing that you need is some basic knowledge about Git and very basic knowledge about Java and HTTP protocol. So to get started, this is the repository address which you should clone. I will be using throughout this course IntelliJ, but you might choose to use something else. It would be nice also to have at hand Jmeter documentation or the main page stored somewhere in the bookmarks, and you will have to download Jmeter from the official page. I'm using Jmeter version 5.0, which you can find in the archive. The current one is version 5.1. But I recommend that you use the same version as I do so that we have consistent results. Okay, so let's get started. I will use this repository and I will clone it in my IntelliJ. And I'll give it a name, Jmeter introduction. Well, if it asks you whether you want to create a project, then yes, you do want a project. Okay, let's finish. And now I should be able to see the contents of my repository. Okay, before we begin, a little bit about how this course is structured and how we are going to work, and also what are the topics that we are going to cover. So each new functionality or each new topic is created within a separate Git branch. So if you want to jump between the topics as we developed our scenario throughout this course, you can just do so. You can always also get back to the point in time where you left off, and you can reset the branch to the previous state. So we'll be using this a lot. Just to make sure that we don't make any mistake as we build up our scenario, because this is a hands-on course. So we have IntelliJ, we have the connection to our Git repository, and we can see the course contents. We'll be covering the base, very basics of Jmeter. We'll be making first request. We'll use elements like request defaults and user variables to save time and maintenance effort. We'll look into logic controllers, processors, samplers, so elements where we can code things in Jmeter. We'll talk about the test plan structure, how we can reuse elements. We'll talk about making our scenarios a bit more realistic, so how we can also apply elements like cache managers to make them so. We'll talk about extractors, running tests and reports, and debugging at the end, and this will be divided into 3 separate videos, so make sure to watch all the 3 parts. Except for that, we also need Jmeter downloaded. So from the page that I showed you, you can download the version you choose, but the recommended one is 5.0. I downloaded this 5.0 version and unzipped it to my folder. Now, in order to run it, you need to navigate here where you will find Jmeter path file, which will start the Jmeter GUI. And the only thing you need to have is the Java in version 8. So make sure you have that prior to running Jmeter. Okay, so let's start it. Okay, I'll make sure to have IntelliJ and Jmeter as first two tools. Alright, we have just started Jmeter, so you should probably know that this is the user interface for Jmeter, and the purpose of this user interface is to develop test plan, so to develop actual test scenario for your performance tests. When you run performance tests, then you are running or you run them without GUI, because GUI has some overhead cost. So when you run real scenario, you won't be doing that from the user interface, graphical user interface. So you have a number of options in here, and the main concept of Jmeter is the test plan, where you define the steps and logical elements of a test plan and their connections, repetitions, control flow, and so on. But when you save your plan, it gets saved into actual XML file, and we'll have a look at it right now. The important things about the XML file, which is the result of basically you designing the test, is that it stores the version of Jmeter with which it was created, and also it's not meant to be read by humans. So if you store your performance test as code, which is recommended, when you do the reviews, then you won't do it on the textual basis, but rather you'll do visual review in the Jmeter. So even though you can store test as a code, this is not meant to be read by humans, but you might choose to do so. Anyway, let's go back to our user interface. We are here. You see a number of options. Some of them are very useful. I will be using them throughout this course. For instance, here, if you click in that triangle, then you will get the log output here. You can also define to change your level of logging. As you can see, we can choose between a number of them, and I invite you to explore those options. But we'll probably be using info_debug. You can run your test plan, even an empty one, the way it is right now, by clicking this this button. It will ask you whether you want to save it or not. In our case, let's just first open the test scenario that we have on the empty branch, just to make sure that we are doing the right thing here. So it's in here, in my case. Okay, I have test plan and one test thread group. If you don't have it, then you can add it like that. And we can run it. As you can see, when I run it, I get some information login in here. Another one to run is from here. And you can also use a very convenient keyboard shortcut, Ctrl+S to save the plan, Ctrl+E to erase the log file, and Ctrl+R to run it. So you'll use it a lot because it's convenient. So Ctrl+S, ER, and then we just have run it, and before the run we have emptied the log file. So you'll use it a lot, worth to mention. When you run your test, you can either run it locally or you can run it on your distributed farm if you have one. Usually performance testers have either the locally set up distributed farms, a number of nodes to generate the huge load against the application in test, or external cloud providers are used, like Jmeter or Sauce Labs. In my case, I have my own farm, but we are not going to cover running tests against the remote nodes. Last but not least, just to finish this part, it's worth mentioning that the central concept in Jmeter's test plan will create all other elements starting from this one as the root node. And throughout this course, we'll be running our tests against Google.com because, well, they have lots of nodes and firepower, and I'm pretty sure we won't do any damage. It's worth remembering when you run performance tests, it might actually have disastrous effect on the application in test, but I think Google can survive this. Okay, that's the first part, so the introduction. There is some exercises within the branch if you want to do it. The first one is run test, check for log file entries, modify log level to error, see whether something changed, and also exercise is Ctrl+SER key shortcut, which we did. And the second is open Jmeter introduction file and see contents and what type of file is that. If you want to take some time, please stop this video and get back to it when you are done. For others, I'll just show you how to do it. First, let's check the log level to error. We can see that the information about that has been displayed, and then we are using Ctrl+SER to run the test. And nothing gets logged in because there is no error message. So let's just get back to here, and we have lots of input because we use different logging level. The second is open the Jmeter introduction file. We've just been here and we can see it's an XML file. Okay, since we made some changes to this branch, if you want to start with clean one, then you can use your IDE functionalities and you can reset back to head. Just remember to do it hard so that all the changes that we made are wiped out. Then the only thing you need to do is to reload again, and we are back to the beginning. Okay, that's great. So we have just went through the basic introduction. I also invite you to go here and see what other options you have, but we'll be covering some of them as we go. Okay, now let's move on to the second part. So it's high time that we make our first request against Google. So I will check this branch locally because I haven't done so yet. But I won't be reloading my plan. I'll try to do everything that's described in here with you. Let's just see what are we looking at doing this time. Well, we want to run our first request against Google.com, and in order to do it, we'll use some basic elements of a test in Jmeter. So thread group, this simulates a number of users accessing something in parallel. We'll use samplers, which are basic elements that are responsible for taking action. So for instance, if you want to issue HTTP requests, make SQL call, you'll be doing that with samplers. And we'll also add some basic listeners that will allow you to visualize the results that you get. So we'll use thread group, sampler, a listener. We'll also use sampler results. So we'll see how request and response looks like. And we'll also try to name the elements that we are using mnemonically. That means so that we know what the purpose of those elements, because the names that we get when we insert those elements are default and are just not good for documentation. Okay, so we should start with the thread group. I have one, so just so that you believe me, I can add it again. Thread group basically simulates number of users in parallel, and there are three main things that you should know about here. Number of threads, it means number of users. You can put 10, 100 here. Right now we'll just stick to one. Ramp up period is the period of time in which those users become active. So if you set it to 10 seconds and you set it to 10 users, then every 1 second one more user will join the test. So in the first second you will have one, in the second second you will have two. The pace at which users join is proportional to the interval. And then how many repetitions of actions in the plan in the thread group should happen. So we'll leave those to free, but you will learn very soon to work with those values as something central to your plan. Okay, so thread group doesn't mean anything if we don't have any sampler in it. So we will use probably one of the most commonly used ones, which is HTTP requests. With this sampler, you can issue HTTP requests to the server or application under test. Now, we want to test for Google.com. We actually want to use that address. Well, let's just make com. We want to check the performance of this page, so we'll try to fetch it and see how fast it responds. So I should write in here www.google.com, and that's it. I can already start my first request. So I will do it with the keyboard shortcut SER, and there is nothing wrong. It looks like everything went fine. Actually it did, because there is no error in here. I issued the first request, but the problem is that we didn't notice that there is too much O's. Okay, I mean, it completed fine. I don't see any errors. But at this point, we are not yet sure whether this actually completed successfully. I made an error, and if we check, then you can see that Google.com is kind of a fishy domain. So we are not sure whether when our previous request completed, it was fine. We need to have some insight into the status of our request, and for that we can use listeners. Listeners are elements that will capture information about the request that we sent. So we can click on the test plans and ask those listeners. For starters, we can use view results tree listener and also graph results. So this second one will actually visualize our request times in a chart form. Okay, and now let's use the same combination of Ctrl S, E, R shortcuts to run it. And as you can see here, I have a very small dot. You might not be able to see that because it obviously makes more sense when we have lots of requests. But here I should be able to see my first request. And as you can see, I have also some information about that related to Jmeter, like load time, connect time, latency, sizes, and so on and so forth. What's important is the requests that I can see. Here I can verify I indeed issued a GET request towards HTTP www.google.com with some headers, and I can see what's the response that I received. And I can see here the response body, which basically is DOM. So it's like basic HTML frame. I'm not going to read through that because it's not so important. There's a bunch of JavaScript. But what's important is response headers, where you can see whether your request completed successfully. If you remember, HTTP 200 calls mean a successful request, and that's why my request is red. But if I go and I will actually make a request to something that doesn't exist, then you see it turns red. And this is a no-host exception. Something like that doesn't even exist. So let's get back to something that works. Okay, we are back to green. So you can rerun it and leave it in a healthy state. So here you can see response headers, response body, and request. And this is a very fundamental thing for Jmeter. Okay, and this is really a very short second part of our Jmeter course. Now it's time for exercises. So again, if you are with me, you might decide to pause video at this point and do all the exercises yourself, or you can just follow me and see how I resolve those exercises. So exercise number 0 is, let's change the domain to google.com and observe number of requests. Try to explain what happened. Okay, I will do just that. What could be the change? As you can see, here is one issue requested. One request issued, sorry. And now something's changed. As you can see here, this plus sign means that we can drill down into the request, and we actually had 2 of them. Now when we go to the response headers, then we can see that the first one is actually a redirect. So when I hit http google.com, I got redirected to http www.google.com. So when you run your test, you also need to have basic knowledge about application under test and the domains where under which those applications are available. As you can see, there is a big difference between making 1 and 2 requests. Exercise number 1, change number of threads, so users, loops, and ramp-up period to 10 and observe the results. Change that over here. And then I can just use my favorite SER combination to run it. As you can see, each of them is made up of these 2. And as you can see now, I'm actually generating some load. On the graph results, I can observe what are the average execution time, what's the throughput, what's the median execution time. And if I have lots of them, then I can already do some trend analysis. All of them have been successful. It's also worth noticing that when you start users, you just think about thread group as a user, then you can see when, at which point in time they start. So as you can see, the first one started at 58 minutes 32 seconds, then a second later second, and second later another one and another one. As you can see, they start within 1 second each, so proportionally to the ramp-up period that we set. Okay, what's the third one? Let's add additional HTTP samplers for head and delete, run, and explain the results. Okay, I can use this duplicate functionality in Jmeter, and I need to change the method from get to head. I will also change it to delete. Okay, so I have now 1 get, 1 head, and 1 delete request. Delete aims at deleting the resource that is available at that address. I will maybe change it to www.google.com to make only 1. Okay. And head checks whether the resource at this address exists without downloading it. So that's the meaning of them. Let's just run it. Okay, we can see that some of them are failing. Here we can check which one was issued get. We got a successful response. Here we set head and we got successful response. Here we issued delete and the response was not allowed. Okay, obviously one cannot just wipe out the Google main page. Therefore the server returned us a response that sorry man, but you cannot execute this type of command on my server. That's what happened. If you are more interested into HTTP protocol, then you can find lots of material in internet. Let's get back and see whether we have any more exercises. Yeah, number 3 is try to add another listener, aggregate your report, and see what it gives you. We are doing this like that. We are clicking add listener and aggregate report. And now let's just again run our scenario with a combination of SER. As you can see, all of those have the same name, and therefore we don't know which ones was issued for get, head, and delete in the aggregate report. If you want to make the distinction, we need to give them different names, for instance, names that will tell us what it is for. So let's run it again with those new names. And now you can see that our requests are broken down by the name, and it gives us a good idea of what the purpose is of those requests. As you can see, we can clearly see from that listener that all the delete requests are failing. Therefore, there is something wrong. It's a signal for you as test developer that you should look into more detailed listeners and see why, and you should get it from that view, for instance. But these are very useful listeners that very often you'll be working with on a daily basis. Also, you can find here information about the number of requests, average, median times, response times, percentile response times, throughput, and error rate. And the last exercise, which I think is important, especially at the beginning, is about naming your elements mnemonically. In other words, that means try to name it so that it's clear what's the purpose of the request. So for instance, you can try to use something like that, but even better if you use something like that. Well, this is actually head. I'm pretty sure everybody has, after some time, their own convention, how you want to use it. HTTP head, you could say download. HTTP head, you can say check. I'm pretty sure that you will find your own way also pretty soon. So I would also change the test plans. So I would say something like test for google.com. The thread group, I would say I would leave it as it is, and those values I would change. So that's it. We've just done all the exercises. So if you want to know whether you get proper responses, then you can also now reset your Git branch hard to head. This will make sure that all the local changes you've done so far are wiped out, and as you did it, you can just reload it. And you can use here the plus sign to expand all items. And as you can see, well, the solution for the exercise assumes a bit different test name, but every time I do it, I call it different names. But the rest is pretty similar here. Okay, so we have just finished writing our first requests. We know how to use the samplers, thread groups, that we should also call elements in the plan and mnemonical names, and also we know how to use listeners, so that's just great. Now it's time to move to the next part. And that part is about request defaults and user variables. So in other words, when we look at what we have, then we can see some repetitions. And obviously, the more hard-coded values we have in our plans, the more maintenance cost it means for us in the future. So for instance, this is a very good example. We have 3 different requests, but they all have the same literal value, like Google.com here, Google.com here, Google.com here. Now, if I have like tens of them and I have to change that to Google.es, for instance, to the Spanish version, then I have lots of work to do. So it's hard to maintain, especially when your test plans are large and it's not so rare that they grow. So we'll work with 2 elements. One is called HTTP request defaults, and another user variables, in order to parameterize the plan and reduce the cost of maintenance. We remove the delete sampler because it's failing. Then we'll add the user-defined variables as the first thing. We'll add HTTP request defaults to reduce repetitions. And then we'll also define some of other parameters except for URL in user variables. So let's start with deleting that. We won't need that anymore. Now, as we did it, we can add user-defined variables. And you do it like that. Add config element and user-defined variables. What are user-defined variables? Well, as the name suggests, these are variables. Like in any programming language, you can define variables here and then they are available for you in the rest of the plan. Except for variables, in Jmeter we also have properties. Properties have global scope and variables have scope that is related to the thread group that applies. Here we'll first try to reduce some repetitions with user variables. So the natural candidate is google.com. You are using variables by writing the following formula. So you will start with $, then parentheses, brackets, and then the name of the variable. I will actually make exactly the same here. The only thing that's left is I need to actually create this variable, the name of URL and value of, let's make it www.google.com. Now, since we made a small change, we should test whether our test works. So we need to test our test. And this is what I did. As you can see, everything works. Here I can look at the request that was issued and I can see that the variable for the GET request has been substituted correctly from the variable, user variable, which is defined in here. So it's a first success. In the meantime, I'll just reduce that to one request so that we can do it faster. As you can see, we got 2 requests. Both are using the variable and it's successful. If you want to reduce further duplications, and especially for HTTP requests, then we can use some additional config elements. So similarly, we can use config elements like HTTP request defaults, and I can place them in different places in the test plan, and their scope will depend where I place them. If I place them here, it will apply everywhere. If I place them here, this will apply to the thread group and another thread group, and so on and so on. So it matters where you place them. I will place them here because it doesn't matter for me at the moment. And I will try to save myself time by defining the default server name. So instead of using this, I will leave it blank and I will allow this element to derive the defaults from this element. And I will just move it here and I will also remove it from here. And I should expect the same result. As you can see, I got exactly the same result, but here I don't have the URL. If you didn't provide it here, then it got it from here. And that's how, in addition to user variables, you can also reduce the configuration overhead. But if you want to change one of them to something else, then that's how you do it. And as you can see, here I got another domain call. Let's just remove it. And now it's time to perform exercises. So once again, if you'd like to do them themselves, then pause video at this point and get back to us when you're done. But if you want just to see how I do it, then please bear with me. So the exercise is define more user variables that you can use to parameterize the plan. So ramp-up period, number of threads or users, and loops. Okay, here I'm using also things that can be parameterized. So for me it makes sense to put them in one place and call them like by the purpose. And I just call threads users because often it simulates the users, and I will give them some default values. Let's just make 2 so that you believe me it works. And here I will replace hard-coded values with variables. Okay, as you can see, even here in Jmeter user interface, threads have the second meaning of user. So that's one more argument why we can use those meanings interchangeably. Okay, so the final test is actually to run your tests. We should expect twice that many requests. Okay, and it's even more because there are 2 loops. So we got 8. As you can see, it works fine. And now when I want to push something, so for instance, I want to like create more users in my test plan, I just do it in one place. And the maintenance of the parameters or the parameterization is basically contained within that element. And as you can see, it's easy to control the tests right now. Okay, now if you wonder whether that's exactly the same solution that is provided in the Git repository, then we follow the same pattern. First, we go to Git and we need to reset ourselves hard to the head. As we did, we can refresh. And, well, use the plus sign to just make it larger. And as you can see, I used some different parameters, and here I think I used uppercase U in ramp up, but other than this, I also used the user's name here, but other than this, it follows the same principles. So that's great. And right now, we will proceed to the last area that I want to cover in the first part. So we'll cover some logic controllers. But before we do so, let's just recap that right now we already know what Jmeter is, how we develop tests, we know how the tests are stored, we can issue our first requests, we can control and parameterize configuration of tests, and that already gives us a good starting point. So just remember from time to time that you can always have a look at the JMix file and see how it grows, and you will sooner or later find out that what I'm saying about that document not being meant for the humans is completely true. Okay, so let's move now to logic controllers. Okay, that should be ready. And let's see what's the plan for this module. So we want to use some basic logic controllers that allow us to control the flow of our tests. And we also want to add some delays. So in the real world, when we issue requests, then if we want to simulate users, then they never do it like immediately one after another. There's some thinking time, sometimes there's some delay, those requests follow some distributions, and hence we need some way of making intervals between them, and the simplest one is the timer controller. And the simplest logic controller and the most used ones are if controller and loop controller. Additionally, we'll also cover here the further additional way how you can save yourself time maintenance, test maintenance time. So except for variables, using defaults, we'll be using test fragment, symbol control, and module controller trio to basically separate some reusable elements in our test plan and reuse them. Okay, so here, imagine the situation that I want first to check whether the resource exists before I download it. So the first thing I need to do, I need to issue a head request just to check, hey, knock knock, are you there? And then in case I'm successful, then I want to download it. So that's the logic. That's what I want to do. That's the order I got from my customer. How do I do it? So I need some kind of control, and I will use for that the if controller. So I will add an if controller by adding logic controller if controller. Since I want to conditionally execute get, I need to make it a child of if controller. And I also want to define the condition as if HTTP head request is successful, then I only do get. So you can use actually the condition from here, which is perform the action within me if the last sample was successful, because in our case the last sample is head, so it's easy to use. Here you put the expression evaluation. Now if you put the $sign here, you can evaluate the expression in JavaScript, in Groovy, in like internal Jmeter expression language. Basically you have ability to choose here. If you wonder how it works, then you can, being in this element, you can click on help, and this should bring up the page with the explanation of this element. So use it a lot, it's useful, don't try to remember. So in my case it's simple, I will just use the default expression evaluation even from that example here. So let's test it. Okay, so it looks like nothing changed. I have a number of head and get requests, so it means that the if was true. But let's just make here some problem. Let's put here something that doesn't exist. See whether we get anything. You see the head are failing and we don't see gets following, which means that if was evaluated to false. So the if controller works as designed. We conditionally run now the get request based on the head request result. But let's make it a little bit more realistic. Let's add the timer controller, but we want to add it to head. So before any head made, we want a delay of, let's say, 50 milliseconds. And we can call delay me element. Now, if you run it right now, you probably won't even notice 50 milliseconds. But if you put it like 500, then you will already see that. And now, well, there's been some delay. Obviously, the higher you put the value, the more visible it is. So let's leave it at 50 milliseconds so it doesn't delay our testing too much. And let's modify our test case right now. Let's say that the customer defined it, okay, I would like you to issue the request to Google.com if it exists, but twice. The first thing you would like to do is probably, well, let's just duplicate it, it will work. Well, obviously it will work, we can quickly check it whether it works. Yeah, it works for every head, we get 2 gets, but it's not very developer-like, and you'd like to make it more, let's say, smart. So we won't use that approach. Let's just delete that element. Instead, we'll use the loop controller. So logic controllers are all elements that control the control flow. So since I want this to be executed in the loop, I need to put it in here. And the loop controller default value is 1, and I want to make it 2. Right, or not, I get the same result. Yep, for every head I'm getting 2 subsequent gets, so it works. Maybe I should also prove that I can do 3 here. Yep, all works as expected. So as you can see, logic control elements are very useful if you want to influence how often and in which condition your samplers should be used. And this already gives you some notion how the Jmeter plans are being built. Now, if we go back to, let's say, the topic for this part, then we can see that we covered already if loop controller and constant timer, but we still have this trio of controllers, well, trio of elements, test fragment, simple controller, and module controller that we haven't spoken about. And as I said, this is another way for us to avoid copying elements in the plan. So if now I need to do it for, let's say, in 2 places in my test plan, then I would be copying it. But there's a better way of doing it, and it's those three of these 3 elements. So you are achieving this by using test fragment. Test fragment can be disabled by default. Even if you can enable it, doesn't matter. It's just a sack for elements that you want to reuse. So if you're a developer, you can think of it as a package. So if you want to have some reusable elements, you just put it in a separate module or package, and then you use it as dependency in that application, another application, or within one application even. So it's just our kind of a module where we put things we want to reuse. But this fragment is just as a bag, a sack for other elements. If you want it to be useful, then on top of it, we will add a simple controller. Simple controller is basically another bag, but it needs to be a controller type, so we can put it in here. Having it here, we can call it, for instance, let's call it something we want to replace. Let's name it like that for the time being, and then we shall see. Now we can move this entire element, or that one, to that bag. In this case, it's just one call, but it can contain a big part of the test that is reusable. So because it's just one, then I will copy the name to the simple controller one, because that's the name that will be visible when I try to insert it here. Now I defined this piece as something reusable. Now I need to put it into my plan, and I'm doing it by using another type of controller called module controller. And here I can find my reusable test fragment from here. You can also choose to click here, and it will bring you back to the definition of that element. But for the time being, I will just use that. Well, the names I should probably change so they are more meaningful. Well, I copy that, because in that case it's just one request. And now I'm defining those elements in here, but if I want to use it again, duplicate for instance, well, I can do it. As you can see, I can put one get request in here. Sorry, that should be a head request, obviously. And when I do it, then what follows is head request, 3 get requests, and 1 head request, which is exactly the realization of this piece. With the difference that for each of those calls, this test fragment is called. So as you can see, it's a great save of time and effort, especially in the maintenance. So you know already the third way of saving yourself time and cost of maintenance for the performance test. User variables, defaults, and also test fragments or test fragment simple controller module controller trio. Let's go to exercises now. The exercise is use variables for all hard-coded values, and the number 2 is replace constant timer with another type of timer. So again, if you want to do it yourselves, then pause the video right now, otherwise bear with me. Okay, so let's just replace everything that's hard-coded with the variables. I'll just remove that. That was just for demonstration purpose. And let's just navigate through those elements and see where we have something that we can replace. Okay, so the loop count is something that we can replace. So let's call it repeat. I'm calling that repeat because we already have loops in here. And I will put here repeat. It's fine. Let's see whether there is anything else. Maybe in the test fragment, you can also use variables in test fragment. Well, there is a delay. So let's add the delay. And that's 50. And you have the description part, so it's good to use it. I will just make sure it says 50 milliseconds. And now, since I made changes, I will test my tests. All green, so all good. I have just saved myself time, but by using variables. The second exercise is by using another timer. So the timer that we are using, we can disable. All elements in Jmeter can enable disable. It's not active right now. And when you do it, you can, for instance, decide to insert another one for some time. So we'll use the timer, but another one. And once again, when you don't know what time to use, just go to Jmeter documentation. I will use uniform random timer with some predefined offset and then some random delay. Let's say I'll use it like that. Now I'll run it, and obviously we won't be able to see the difference between them, but you should know that there are different kinds of timers. Some follow some distributions, and depending on what you want to achieve, you have some elements that are already out of the box for you to use. So great. Once again, if you want to see whether we actually did everything right, you can reset yourself to the hard to the head and refresh here, and then extend the test. Well, as you can see, I used here different names, but we are about right with the wait time and the repeat time. It's just a matter of using different names. So that's it. That's the first part, just summing up. See what you've managed to go through. So you started to develop your test. You know how the test is stored. You know how to move around the user interface. You know how to make HTTP requests, how to save yourself time with defaults and user variables, and how to control basic flow of your test and use the trio of module, simple controller, and test fragment so that it's just easier for you to manage. I will invite you for the second and third part of the video, so make sure that you will also see it. Thank you, and I see you in the second part of this course.